Ready? All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse DePrez. I'm a communication major here at Brockport. And the topic of my presentation and the research I've been doing over the last, couple months now is the genre shift of inaugural addresses using a specific analysis called the dramatistic analysis process. I'm going to get more into, I'm sure you heard a couple words there that you might not have known. They're kind of communication specific, but I'll try to clarify everything as much as possible as I go through. So just to preview everything before I go through it, I'm going to start with an introduction where I'll go over my hypothesis. I'll work into those key terms I talked about to help you understand as I'm talking through it. I'm going to specify what the genre of an inaugural address is. Then I'm going to go into my methodology or the specific process that I used. Go into my results, which is kind of mixed with the discussion. It's a little bit hard to separate them with something as it's more subjective in communication. So they're going to be a little bit mixed, but I'll clarify when it's not just pure results and it's mixed with discussion. I'm just then going to show you some examples of what the actual peer results look like. I'm not going to bore you with all the nitty-gritty details of the results and more give you a broad perspective of it. Then I'm going to go into the more traditional discussion portion where I'm going to go over the whether or not my hypothesis is proved, the potential implications that go along with that, and then kind of takeaway points in going forward after the presentation. So my hypothesis, as you can read it up there, is that the genre of inaugural addresses since the beginning of the 21st century has shifted from the traditional definition. And traditionally, an inaugural address or an address given by the president after he's made president of the United States is to unify people under specific policy and get coercion from the people to follow that new policy. And my hypothesis is saying that we've shifted in the 21st century from that definition of the address, and now it's more going towards getting coercion of following a specific narrative and specific myths that go along with it. So after hearing all that, you're probably wondering, like, all right, why do I care? This sounds like a lot of communication jargon. Well, Burke, a theorist in communication and a philosopher in general, said to fail to become a critic would be to ignore human motives, and that's often disastrous. So failing to look at why people are doing something is often ignoring the root of some problems. All right, so here's some key communication terms that are going to come up a lot throughout this presentation, so having an understanding of them would help a lot. So a genre is just a generally agreed on way that an artifact or a speech or any written or spoken piece of work, how it's organized and its purpose. So there's genres for everything in communications, from a eulogy to even a debate. There's specific ways that is traditional to do them and ways that the audience expects them to be done. A narrative is just, if you understand first that humans tell stories, and we tell stories to understand broader concepts, explain problems, explain why things are, so that you can come up with a solution to them. So a narrative is just a story that essentially tells a problem and then shares a solution without usually getting into specific ways to solve it, but more a broad concept that would solve the solution. Myths is one that a lot of people who aren't in communication have a hard time getting over, because when you hear myth, you usually think like something that's false or a fable. But a myth is just really an abstract concept that's often attached to politics or philosophy, and it's an explanation for human activity or behavior. Burke and the term Burkean, just meaning of like Burke's work, is going to be used a lot. He was, as I said, a communication scholar, a philosopher, and he really wanted to get to the root of human activity and why people were the way they are and what they did. A criticism is another thing that isn't exactly how it is in the real world. It just means an analysis, essentially. If I'm saying I'm critiquing something, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm doing an analysis of it. And then an artifact is just a piece of verbal or written language. All right, so now that I've explained what a genre is, what is the traditional genre of an inaugural address? So from a few different sources, since the beginning of inaugural addresses, they followed the same set of rules, essentially, ways that they're carried out and the reason behind them. So inaugural addresses from a historical perspective have been about introducing policy that's going to be done over the course of a term, and then trying to get people to agree with that policy or get coercion to it. This definition is what you would call results driven. It doesn't focus on why the speaker is saying what they're saying, but what they want to get out of it. So in theory then, if by the traditional definition, there shouldn't be narratives involved in an inaugural address because they're talking about specific policy, where a narrative talks about a broader concept and more focuses on purpose. So I'm going to be doing something called a dramatistic criticism, which is something that Burke created to analyze speeches from the inaugural addresses from the 21st century in order to try to pull out narratives. Because if a narrative can be pulled out from an inaugural address, or several narratives or myths can be pulled out from these inaugural addresses, then it'll show that there's been a shift in the genre of an inaugural address. So my methodology was actually pretty simple. I pulled the first inaugural address from the 4 presidents we've had in the 21st century. There's been a total of 6 inaugural addresses in the 21st century, but oftentimes the second address has a different genre than the first. It has a different purpose. So for fairness sake, I chose the first of all 4 21st century presidents. The next step is to collect relevant background information, because a speech in the abyss is simply that. You need to have a context that goes along with it to help form those narratives. And then I performed what Burke calls his dramatistic probes. And that's where you look into the speech and look specifically for elements of hierarchy, which is where there's either an implicitly or explicitly explained ladder where certain people or certain things are lower than others. I'm going to look for things that are argued to be good and argued to be bad. Look for scapegoats, or things that are blamed for the root of people's problems or the root of society's problems. And then these 2 scapegoats and strategies for ascension are 2 of the most important. Strategies for ascension are ways to move up that hierarchy and escape the burden placed on people by those scapegoats. I'm also going to look for declared truth or even things that are declared to be false, because anytime that a speaker says something is true or false, it has intrinsic power loaded into it. And in communication, nothing is ever truly true or false. So there's always power loaded in a statement that's said to be true. I'm also going to look for association, where the speaker tries to make himself closer to the audience, and separation, where he separates himself from a group of people or from the audience. Now, this is all the stuff that happened behind the scenes. So actually, I'll show you this first. So this is what some of the raw data just collected. This is really a summarization of the raw data from one of the speeches. The process goes through and pulls quotes of each probe and collects them, and then also collects the relevant background information from the time. I used only sources from the time of the speech. I found that to be fair and more accurate. People talking about events at the time they were happening. This usually included political problems, economic problems, and social problems. So as you can see for this one, the background information going into George W. Bush's inaugural address was there was a lack in public officials, lack of trust in the democratic process. There was the beginning of the economic recession, which the dot-com bubble hadn't burst yet, but it was leading up to that. And then a continued fear of nuclear weapons that continued throughout the 21st century. And then, I mean, you can read through them right now, but just from that one, probably 7-minute speech, These are quotes that fall into the categories of hierarchy, argued good, argued bad, scapegoat, strategies for ascension, truth, all that. So what I ended up coming up with through that is these conclusions. They're results kind of mixed with discussion. All four of the speeches contained elements from the probes that I analyzed the speeches with. Leading up to each inauguration, there was always some form of crisis, whether that be economic, political, distrust in the system, things like that. It's pretty common, especially in the 21st century, that leading up to an election, things just seem to go wrong. There was also a lot of elements of scapegoats and strategies for ascension found in all four of the speeches. And these were most critical, as I said, for developing those narratives. And then the examples of backgrounds from each speech varied, as well as the narrative that they were presenting. But what's important for proving the hypothesis is that there were narratives present, not necessarily what the narratives were. Depending on a person's political party and the background at the time, the narrative that they're using is obviously going to change a lot. However, the fact that the speeches are moving away from a policy-driven address to a narrative-driven address is what's going to, in the end, support the hypothesis. So I already showed you that. So here's more of the formal discussion. So like I said, every speech had significant but different backgrounds and created different narratives. Here are some of the examples of the narratives. I'm not going to read them all for you, but the American dream, nationalism, returning America to its former glory. Depending on the time, they were always different. Because different narratives fit different time periods and different problems. But what's important and what ended up supporting my hypothesis is that no speeches centered around the unification under policy or the discussion of specific policy. It was always about a broader concept or narrative or myths that were the point of the speech. It was unifying people under the narrative and not under a policy. And that's what I said in the next line is every speech used concepts of scapegoats and strategy of ascension to build that narrative. So the shift in genre, I also noticed was more and more noticeable as time passed. The George W. Bush's speech had far less examples, still not policy-centered, but far less examples of narratives and myths than as time passed. By 2016, Donald Trump's speech was almost entirely centered around narratives, and the pattern continued with Biden. If this pattern continues, then the genre of an inaugural address will likely have to change, and it'd probably be broken into two separate genres with traditional inaugural addresses and modern inaugural addresses. Now, this new theme is potentially dangerous to public access to policy. If politicians, this is only looking at one aspect of political address, but if this theme is happening across the board in political addresses from presidents, public access to policy that presidents or future presidents are trying to put into place is going to become less and less accessible, which you can obviously see would be a problem. The more the American people know, in theory, the better. So going forward, this experimental research project kind of connects traditional rhetoric, rhetorical criticism with modern rhetorical criticism. Traditionally, or in modern criticism, you don't really usually look at the genre. So I connected two theories, being genre criticism and dramatistic criticism, to figure out if there was a genre shift going on. I think that if I were to explore this into the future, it needs to be looked at whether this is happening across the board in presidential addresses, whether that be debates, State of the Union addresses, public crisis messages. And I have a feeling, not supported by this research, however, that this is the case and that the genre is shifting across the board. I also think that addresses prior to the 21st century should be looked at just to confirm the time period that the genre started to shift. I looked solely at the 21st century and took a lot of sources on what the claim genre of the addresses was. So doing a little bit of a confirmation research that addresses have followed the traditional genre until the 21st century would definitely be a valid path of pursuit. So takeaways, as I said earlier, everyone is personally responsible to be their own critic. You know, no one's going to tell you what on the news is a narrative and what's an actual policy. No one's going to tell you whether you're being told to believe in a specific person or a story or a policy. So that's everyone's personal responsibility, and understanding and being able to use a criticism like this, even in a simplified form, would make the people a lot more informed about what they're being told to believe in. Thank you. Oh, any questions? Sorry.